Hey everyone, and welcome to a special digital event, How to Help Your Kids and Students Mental Health. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at The Ridge, and Tyler is also a pastor on staff at The Ridge, and we're joined by a special guest. Tyler, would you mind introducing our special guest?
Absolutely. I first met Will at a gathering of Next Gen pastors in Atlanta in early 2020. And Will started sharing some of the content that we're actually going to hear from him share with us in just a little bit. And as I heard this content, I was our kids and student pastor at the time. I was so excited because I wanted to share this with our kids small group leaders, our high school small group leaders, because the content was just so helpful and practical. In fact, I know if you're watching or listening to this event right now, you have a child or a student or a teenager in your life that you want to feel more comfortable and confident in talking about these things, because these things are so important. In fact, it's a critical issue for us to talk about. And Will is actually the right person to do this with. Will is a national speaker. He's the founder of Curate Hope, which is an organization that provides school programs that promote mental health and resilience. He's been a pastor of kids and students in the next generation world for over 15 years. And he's the co-author of the book Seen, which I have a copy of that right here. Seen: Healing Despair and Anxiety in Kids and Teens Through the Power of Connection. And in fact, we have a link to that book in the description below. As you hear from Will, you'll learn that Will is just passionate about finding practical ways to bring hope to kids and teens who are facing increasing amounts of anxiety, depression, and despair. Will is actually coming to us. He lives in the Sunshine State with his wife, Arian, and 3 kids. So Will, welcome. It is so great to have you here, bud.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes,
Absolutely.
and I am in the Sunshine State, so it's probably a little bit warmer right now than where you guys are.
Yeah, here in Wisconsin, we actually have a balmy 38 degrees. It actually hasn't been a bad winter for us so far right now, which has been great. So, hey,
Yeah, that's
Will.
like a heat wave.
Yeah. Oh, it's been a great winter so far. So, hey, Will, we'll jump right in. In the opening of your book, Seen, you actually introduce us to one of your students who has another great name, Tyler, as well. Different Tyler than me, but you shared with him how interactions with him led you down a path to actually write the book Seen. So tell us about that and its implications for what you're seeing for kids and students across the country.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you guys for having me and giving me the opportunity to share with your community. As you mentioned, I was a Next Gen pastor, been Next Gen pastor now for 15 years. And I think when I first started working with kids and teens, early 2000s, you guys can relate with this, is like, we talked a lot about at-risk behavior. We were just trying to reduce at-risk behavior and kind of keep them alive, if you will. And I think even parents who parented teenagers in the 90s can relate with that. But something started to shift in, I would say probably 2012, but it really became apparent to me as someone who worked with kids and teens, probably around 2016. It moved from just being concerned about the mental health crisis to really alarmed about the mental health crisis. And Tyler, who you reference in the book, that's one story of where I just felt like I had a lot of spiritual tools, and my spiritual tools were powerful tools. Like, there's power in Jesus' name, there's power in reading God's word, there's power in all of those things. But I just felt like I was missing some of the practical things when it came to mental health, like Tyler specifically, who struggled with depression. And I just felt like the way that I was navigating that, and I later realized wasn't necessarily helpful. I thought I could just help him kind of get over it, like He-Man over the mental health crisis that he was in, and realized in hindsight that was not helpful. And so as parents and caring adults, as pastors, as ministry leaders, as teachers, I think a lot of us have felt that way. Even in recent years, as this mental health crisis has become even more aware to a lot of us, we're more aware of it post-COVID. We at times probably feel powerless, or we feel ill-equipped, or we just don't know what to do. And I felt exactly that way. And so in 2016, that kind of set me on a journey where I began to really dive into the research, started to talk to some of my mental health friends, that's always been an interest of mine. When I was in college, I changed my major, 5 times, like most of us. But one of my majors at one point was psychology. It's not where I landed. So as I started to talk with my friends and say, hey, how has God wired our brains and what can we do to help the next generation? That's where, these ideas that we share in Scene kind of came from. And Dr. Chinwe Williams being one of those key friends, and her and I started to collaborate together and saying, hey, how do we simplify this? How do we really equip parents and caring adults with tools that we know influence the brain towards healing? And that's where Scene kind of came about, was a response to feeling that myself and seeing the tension that exists.
Hey, Will, as you've kind of shared these practical things that maybe kind of combine with the spiritual elements and things of that nature, have you ever had, I don't know if kickback is the right answer, but I know that in a lot of church circles, there's often that, oh, it has to be this spiritual side.
Yeah.
And there's almost like a rejection of the practical stuff.
Yeah.
Have you felt that and like maybe helped walk some people through that tension?
Yeah, that is a really good point, because I think that has been the historical challenge within the faith community and specifically within the church, that we've often kind of seen mental health challenges as only a spiritual problem. And so the way that I like to navigate this and help kind of realize that it's okay to have some practical tools with this is when we apply the brain as just an organ, and we recognize the brain is an organ. So the brain is unique because it is a unique convergence of the spiritual and the physical together, right? Like thoughts, what are thoughts? Thoughts are kind of spiritual in some ways, right? So the brain is a unique organ, but we also have to remember it is an organ, just like our heart, our beating heart is an organ, our lungs are an organ, our kidneys are an organ. It's a part of our body. And so as Christians, we have this concept when it comes to our health and our body, that we understand that there's practical things that we can take, but we also don't miss the faith side of it, right? So for instance, a key illustration to this would be if we were hanging out and say we were in the same room and I started to have a heart attack, like I went into cardiac arrest, my hope would be that John, you and Tyler would say, hey, let's call 911 and let's get Will to the hospital and let's pray for him right now, right? That there would be a practical step, and then there would be a faith step that coincides with that. It comes together alongside of it. It's faith and action. And we intuitively understand that. Like, we're not going to not act. My hope would be that you guys wouldn't be like, hey, Will's having a heart attack. Let's just pause and pray for the next 10 minutes, Let's pray for sure. Let's pray, but also let's take some action steps. And in the same way, we have to think of our brain that way. Mental health, these practical tools of how we can help influence the brain towards healing, mental health, healthy steps that we can take to promote mental health. Those are all just practical things because God has wired our brain and God knows a few things about our brain, right? And it just so happens that we can even see some really cool themes in the way that Jesus connected with people that really help their mental health, not just their soul. Yes, Jesus healed physical bodies. He 100% is the way, the truth, and the life, and he is the healer and the keeper of our souls. But he also knows a whole lot about our minds and our mental health. And he does he does certain things, even through the Gospels, that you can see that he just shows up and he sees people on a deeper level. And that is really good for their brains.
Hey, Will, one of the key ideas that I've heard you mention and talk about before, and you bring in Scene, kind of tying in the physical with the spiritual, is this key concept of despair. And I haven't really heard despair talked about in the way related to our kids and students' mental health. And so can you define what despair is for us? And when a child or a student is going through despair, what is happening to them mentally, emotionally, physically? Because I think we have many parents watching and leaders watching right now that they've seen this, but they haven't found a way to articulate it. So can you help them understand what is going on?
So Dr. Chinwe and I really wrestled with this idea. And the reason why we landed on despair, because despair is kind of the foundational piece to this. Like sometimes as parents and caring adults, as teachers, as pastors, we feel like we need to diagnose kids. Like we start to see some things that are concerning. Maybe we start to hear of some suicidal ideation, and we immediately want to label it as the two big rocks that are often thrown around in our culture. Well, they have anxiety or they have depression. Mm-hmm. And while that may be true, sometimes we take a lot of complexity and we just broad stroke it into these two diagnoses, if you will. And I don't think that's helpful. And honestly, sometimes I think that puts too much pressure on us as the helpers, as trying to figure out, well, do they have depression? And, what are the symptoms of depression? Like, how many of these symptoms do they have? And I think what's most helpful for parents is that we don't have to figure out our kids' diagnoses. I think that's important for experts, for doctors, for psychiatrists, for counselors to help navigate those things, because they understand the study of the brain a lot deeper than we do. But the one thing that we can do is we can recognize despair. And the reason why we can recognize despair is because we've all felt a sense of despair, whether it was temporary despair or a longer season of despair. We know what it feels like to be in a place of hopelessness, to feel like you're at the end of your rope and you just don't know where else to go. And so if we can start with this point of empathy, of seeing when somebody's really hurting, and then respond in an appropriate way that helps influence them towards healing, I think that's the main key. So all these other pieces are important, but our response is the part that we can play. So I like to think of it as a wraparound approach, right? Like we need doctors, we need counselors, we need medicine at times. Like there's some practical things that are needed. But when it comes to us as parents and caring adults, we have a role to play. And when we apply these things, the brain does predictable things. So the brain responds in predictable ways when we experience stress or, anxiety, like despair is one of those outcomes. But the brain also does predictable things when we feel connection or we feel seen on a deep level. And so the way we like to illustrate this in Seen is we kind of simplify the neuroscience, because most likely if you're watching this or listening to this, you're probably not a neuroscientist, right? And the brain can be really complex. And if you read books about this, sometimes it's like, oh my goodness, like this is a little too much. So we simplified the processes of this neuroscience into two hemispheres of the brain. Now, the brain is made up of a lot more parts than this, but the bulk process can be explained by just breaking down the brain into two sides. You have the right side of your brain and you have the left side of your brain. And so the right side of your brain is predominantly where your emotional processing takes place. This is where your amygdala tends to be more on the right side of your brain, your fight, flight, or freeze, if you're familiar with that phrase. And then the left side of your brain is where we have more of that logical processing, that higher end critical thinking processing. So when we experience stress over time, especially, it can create kind of this drip of cortisol, kind of like a drip, 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 drip. Mm-hmm. Cortisol is a hormone you've likely heard of. It's that stress hormone. And so over time, too much cortisol flooding our system almost creates kind of a despairing between the right side and the left side of the brain. So we like to think of despair as an easy way to remember this. Despair is a dispair between the left side logical and right side emotional side of the brain. And this can be a really, really difficult thing that somebody experiences. Psychologists call this an emotional detachment. There's this sense of feeling kind of detached from my current emotional state. And if you think about it, when you've experienced somebody who's in like crisis mode, or they're experiencing high level of despair, if you ask them how they feel, oftentimes they'll say things like, I feel numb, or they'll say, I don't know how I feel. And the reason why is because when those two sides are detached, when the emotional and left side of the brain are kind of despaired, it's really hard for them to understand what's happening on the emotional side and put it into words, because our language processing exists on the logical left side of the brain. And when the two sides are separated, we just simply can't do it. So this is, as one theologian put it, kind of like the dark night of the soul, if you will, And this can be a lonely place that people experience when they experience this level of despair. Mm-hmm. But just as much as the brain responds predictably in that way, where the two sides kind of detach. The brain also responds predictably to love and empathy in a powerful and profound way. What we see is that through another hormone, oxytocin, when we feel seen, when we feel connection, when we feel empathy, especially from somebody that we know loves us and cares about us, the two sides of the brain can actually re-engage. We can re-engage the logical left side. The core kind of science behind this is called attachment theory and attachment science. It can help reroute back to places where we felt nurtured, we felt safe, we felt seen, and decrease that crisis mode, decrease despair, and bring the two sides back together.
That's really great. And that's the role that parents and caring adults can play, regardless of your education or not, right? It's playing the role of, hey, I want to help you feel seen, to help bring that.
Yeah,
feeling.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's the power of connection. And it doesn't necessarily, I mean, parents have a superpower. They could do it faster and quicker than anybody because the brain has a stronger emotional memory than even cognitive memory. So the brain remembers when you held your child as a young infant, you looked at them, you smiled gently and you rubbed their face, like all of that attachment is still programmed in their minds. And so when they feel seen on deep level, even as a teenager, they're kind of rerouting back to those safe places.
That's really good. And Will, I know as a parent, I have, an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so you feel sometimes the weight of, well, how do I do that? Because you see them going through a moment of despair and you feel this weight and you're like, I'm not sure how to do this. And so, Will, one of the most helpful things I think you've done is you've given some handles for parents and caring adults to be able to do this with some practical tools. Can you share a few of those with us, and how is that helpful? Maybe give some real examples of how this is helpful for kids and students.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. We say connection, and what does connection mean? And sometimes that can just seem too philosophical. So that's what Dr. Chinwei and I really wanted to do with Scene, is we wanted to make connection simple and understand that sometimes we look at these simple connection tools and we almost discard them as, well, they're not complex enough, or it can't be that simple. But it really is that simple. Like the brain responds in predictable ways with connection, with empathy. And so how do we make that practical? Well, one of the first things we talk about is just the importance of showing up. Like, again, that seems like it's almost too simple to matter, but actually showing up is probably 50% of the work. We live in a very digital culture now, right? So we communicate a lot in mediums like this. And whereas, this is a good medium where at least we can see facial expressions, we can hear a little bit of tone of voice, we're still missing core elements of connection. And our brains don't respond to empathy the same way digitally as we do face to face. And the reason why is because if we're talking on the phone or we're reading a text message, we can't feel the empathy. We don't see the facial expressions. We don't always hear the tone of voice, and we certainly don't feel appropriate physical touch. All of that communicates to the brain that somebody cares about me. So we can't really have that kind of power of that empathy, of influencing the brain towards healing without physical presence. So showing up is really important. We intuitively, by the way, know this as parents, don't we? I mean, think about it. Like if we've ever had a best friend or somebody that we really care about go through crisis, what do we typically do? Even if they live in another state, we get on the plane and we just simply show up, right? I think about early on when I was a youth pastor, I was probably like 23. It was in the first couple of years that I was a youth pastor. And I had a student who had an unexpected death, that their father passed away. And I got the call around midnight and just knew that I should just show up, And as I was driving, I picked up his small group leader. His small group leader happened to be the chief of the fire department. And we're driving. I was talking to, his name's Bill. I was saying, Bill, I gotta share this verse. Maybe I can share this verse, or what should I say here? And I was trying to think of all the things I should say to help comfort this kid. And I remember Bill just said, Will, listen, you don't have to say anything. You just simply need to show up. He said, it's called the ministry of presence. And when he said that, it hit me. I'm like, right. We just need to show up, because when we show up, people feel love, right? That's the end result. And so the first step to this connection side is just simply showing up. And in Scene, we take that a little further. We explain what showing up really means, like showing up undistracted, showing up before they ask us to. Like there's different ways that we can show up, but showing up is a big part of that. And then once we show up, we have to kind of slow down and see them, right? As parents, I know I'm guilty of this. I have 3 kids myself. I have a 12-year-old, I have a 9-year-old, and I have a 6-year-old. And sometimes, we're moving 100 miles per hour. We're trying to maybe finish an email. We're trying to get dinner started and get them out the door for some type of activity. And sometimes our lives just get so busy that when our kids try to talk to us or connect with us, sometimes we just miss the emotion. We miss what's really happening. I know that this has happened with me. I remember one day, my son, Liam, he was a little bit younger, and he came home and he wanted me to play Legos with him. And I was, busy trying to finish up some work in my home office. And I said, well, buddy, we talked about after school, you were going to clean your room. And he goes, yeah, I know, but, can we just play Legos? I said, no, you got to clean your room. Okay, well, can you just help me clean my room? No, I can't help you clean your room. You need to clean your room. And we kind of go back and forth on this. And finally, he delays, he leaves, he comes back, he delays back and forth. And finally, I just get really firm. I say, Liam, that's it. Like, go clean your room, like this very firm stance I made, almost like an ultimatum. And I even made him a deal. I said, listen, if you go clean your room, I'll give you $3. But if you don't clean your room, you're going to give me $3. Right. And so he comes back with $3. And he's like, here you go. Here's my $3. I go, no, you're missing the point. I don't want your money. I want you to clean your room. Go clean your room. And the whole thing kind of climaxed to this moment where Liam comes back the 4th time now, and kind of tearful, tears in his eyes. And he has all the money from his piggy bank, and he puts it in my lap. And he says, here's all my money, take it all. If this is what it takes to spend time with you, you can have it.
Oh, wow.
And in that moment, parent guilt came on really heavy. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you're like, oh, geez, I am the worst parent. Like, you just start to feel this. But it was also at that moment, I finally saw him. Like, I saw beyond the behavior and the defiance, and realized he was trying to communicate with me the whole time that for whatever reason that day, he just needed a little bit of connection. He just needed me to stop, slow down, and see him on a deeper level. And so with 1,000 pennies in my lap, I stopped what I was doing. I got down, at his level, on my knees, and looked him in the eye. And I said, buddy, I'm really sorry. I wasn't seeing you. I said, I can see now that you just need some connection. You need some time to connect and talk. And I'm sorry I missed that. And I gave him a hug, and we talked a little bit. And at the end of that connection, like, I went and helped him a little bit with his room, and he still cleaned his room. Like, we got to the principle of, we got to take responsibility and blah, blah, blah. But it was easier for him because he got what he needed first. He needed emotional connection. He needed to be seen. And it turns out, like, he had a pretty rough day at school, and there was a lot more to it than just quote unquote defiance. And so when we show up and we just see a teenager or a kid who's just having a behavioral issue, sometimes we have to pause and say, hey, what's beyond the behavior? Like, what's the emotion that's happening here? And go back to the brain illustration. If we have a right brain activated child where they're just a right brain energy is really, really high, and we try to meet them with just left brain logic or left brain principles, what tends to happen? We kind of fly by them, right? We miss them. So we have to pause and meet right brain with right brain. So if we see that a kid's upset, if we see that a teenager's upset, yes, there's a principle. Yes, there's responsibility. Yes, do your homework. Yes, study. Like, yes, clean your room or whatever. But first, see the emotion. Meet them right where they are. And a way I could have handled this a lot differently is I could have said, hey, tell me what's going on. Like, are you okay? Do you need something? What do you need from me right now? Right. And maybe Liam would have had the ability at that point to say something like, I just want to spend some time with you for a few minutes. Right. And I could have met him right where he was and kind of let him, we would like to say, emotionally exhale. It's like the emotional side of the brain gets so elevated that sometimes they just need a pressure release, just a emotionally exhale it out. Then once that happens and we re-engage the left side of the brain, then we can loop back around and have a left brain logical conversation, or, lead them towards the principle. But we first have to meet right brain with right brain, and not just, meet right brain with left brain, because we tend to miss it. And when we do that, especially if you have a teenager, like when we meet them, if they're right brain activated, they're upset, and we just meet them with left brain logic, what they will typically do is they'll roll their eyes and they'll say, "You just don't understand." And what I've come to realize is anytime somebody says, "You don't understand," what they're really saying is, "You don't see me. You don't see me. You don't see what I'm actually feeling in this moment." So if we can pause and recognize that and say, "Hey, I can see that you're upset," or, "Hey, I can see that you're feeling a little anxious right now," or, "Hey, I can see that that maybe you need to just spend some time, or that there's something on your mind." When we do that first, we allow them to emotionally exhale, and then we can lead them with left brain logic. So when we see them, they feel understood. That's the end result. So those are a couple of them. With all of that, there's a few more tools that come into connection. Like, with seeing, we talk about, just listening. So you can't just show up and see them. You have to also, listen. And we talk about some active listening skills there. And then we also discuss how to build grit, and speak life, because it can't just be listening. Sometimes there's a response and affirmation to that. And, with the building grit section, I think that's a portion that a lot of parents connect with, especially grandparents, by the way, because usually when I'm talking to a grandparent, I say, "And then we have to help them to build grit." Usually, that's all the grandparents are like, "Yeah, that's right." Like, amen, and, and it's true. We do want gritty kids. Like, we want resilient kids. So it's not all about feelings and, just connecting with the emotion and just leaving it there. It's helping lead them to having the grit when they're experiencing negative challenges, that they can overcome those. But that has to be in the context and the wraparound of connection. And I think when we kind of case study the generations and kind of what changed, because we hear that a lot too, like, how did we get here? I think the thing that changed the most is our amount of connection. That in previous generations, we had more face-to-face connection. We had a lot more togetherness. I think about my grandparents' generation. They just sat around living rooms and talked for hours and told stories, right? You guys remember hanging out with your grandparents, and like, if they were around other friends, they would just sit in a living room. They wouldn't watch TV. They wouldn't look at their phones. They wouldn't show each other memes. Like, they would just talk and tell stories. And there's something about how their brains were interpreting all of that connection. They were feeling these micro moments of empathy and love. And so I think that helped the previous generations to have a little bit more resilience in life's challenges. Now, at the same time, here we are fast forwarding, and we can see that in many cases, almost every single demographic, every single generation is seeming to lose a little bit of that resilience power. And, my theory is, and my 2 cents is, I think connection plays a big part of that. And so the more we can get back to a place where we really see each other and we connect and we slow down and connect on a face-to-face level, I think we'll see more resilience and more grit in the next generation.
That's helpful, Will. Hey, as you were talking about those tools and even the shift, because I'm thinking back my past week of just talking with a handful of parents that said, my middle school student or my high school student or my pre-teenager is dealing with these levels of anxiety or depression, and I just don't know how to talk about them. And I don't understand. And I heard you say this earlier when we started, was this was just so different before. We grew up in the 80s, 90s, and seeing that shift. I started being a student pastor in 2007, started noticing the shift where you're saying, hey, one of the biggest concerns at first was the at-risk behavior, but now all of a sudden this is shifted. And so can you walk us through a little bit about what are our students experiencing? Why is it so different? And maybe, you know, do you have a theory or what caused that shift to happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can't uncouple the statistics from the rise of smartphones and social media. You know, it's not a direct cause, because I think there's been a general trend in this direction, but it is an influencing factor. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be said with social media. The way that teenagers are perceiving and receiving information from social media differs based off of gender and age. For instance, we now have a lot more research and understanding of how Instagram is affecting young girls' minds, specifically the teenage mind. We're starting to see more data, even data that came out, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks ago, about how habitual checking on social media changes a teenager's response to social cues and connection long term. Like they almost their system kind of suppresses a little bit more. They're less reactive to some social connection. And that's all from the ripple effects of social media. So we have to understand that the digital age has created a lot more disconnection. When I compare that to how we grew up, like, so for instance, Tyler and John, I don't know how old you are, but, you know, let's say that we grew up before, you know, if you guys were teenagers before really 2005, let's say, chances are you spent time with your friends every day after school. Like, we get off of school, we ride our bikes over to a friend's house, we hang out, or we go to the basketball court, we play basketball, or likewise. Like, so there was a lot more face-to-face connection. So Tyler, let's say that you were in 9th grade and a girl named, you know, Julie breaks your heart, right? And you would go over to John's house, you guys are hanging out, you go, bro, Julie broke up with me. And John, you'd be like, no, dude, you give him a bro hug, you know, and he'd be like, don't worry about Julie. You know, Melissa's been looking at you, you know, she likes you, you know, you try to make her feel better or make him feel better. And with that, like when that happens, we would see each other's kind of go, right? We would see the facial expressions. We would hear the tone of voice. We would feel the bro hug. All of that communicates to our brains empathy, love, seen, right? It's a micro little moment, a micro deposit of connection. Well, now fast forward, 9th grader today experiences the same kind of disappointing event. Now they grab their phone, they text their friend, they say, dude, Julie just broke up with me. And now John doesn't just say, no way. He goes, no way. And then he sends you a GIF or maybe an emoji. But it's not that John's not being empathetic. It's not that he doesn't care or that somehow we care less than in previous times. It's that our brain isn't interpreting the empathy the same way. Like, does that make sense? Like, so the connection is there, but the way that our brains are interpreting the connection is not the same. And I think that's an influencing factor of why we are now in an age where we can feel so connected yet still feel alone, because our friends are empathizing with us, but we're not receiving that empathy the same way. Our brain's not feeling it the same way. So that's another factor that I think has gotten us here. And then there's a lot more pressures. You know, when I talk to teenagers nowadays, they're worrying about things. They're experiencing anxiety on things that you and I didn't really ever fear, you know. Like one teenager I talked to recently is, you know, he started to realize how he didn't want to go to school. And it really was centered around, he subconsciously was afraid of a school shooting. And it's just kind of this low level anxiety that he's worrying about. And another teenager told me, it's like, I feel anxiety every day because I just feel like there's always something bad happening, like every day. And so they're really connected to news, they're connected to information, and all of this information overload is just making it feel so big. And again, I go back 20 years ago, we didn't know about problems halfway around the world unless we turned on CNN or Fox News or something, like one of those news stations, which teenagers never watched, right? Now we find out about those things just because we open our phones, So all these situations kind of are this information overload on the developing brain isn't helpful, and it's increasing our anxiety. Then you add social media and the way that we're perceiving acceptance or rejection, the way that we are diminishing our face-to-face connections and the way that our brains interpret the empathy. I think all of that is a playing factor to why we're here. So I don't like to talk about the why of we're here as much as I like to talk about what can we do from here.
Right.
And I really think that the answer is connection, more and more and more. We have to create rhythms of connection where we're seeing one another. For parents and caring adults, it means being really intentional on connection, like date your kids, like have a standing date where it's just the two of you on a breakfast date or some type of activity. I'm a big fan of little retreats or anything that you can do that kind of disconnects from the digital world to just kind of unplug for a little bit. There's lots of things that we can do, but anything we can do to increase connection, I think, is always a good thing.
That's really
little
helpful.
hacks in that?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Sorry, Tyler. I wonder if there's like little hacks inside of that, right? So it's like you mentioned the texting or the sending a GIF, right? Is there? I don't think students or whoever texting somebody that something wrong happened is going to go away, right? But I mean, maybe it's a coaching to say, hey, if something like that happens, maybe you FaceTime your friend.
Yeah.
These little tiny, small little hacks that would be like just little tweaks. And the reality is part of the reason it's easy to text is because that's natural and it's less vulnerable. But I'm curious, are there any other like that? Or is that just maybe something that you kind of try to acknowledge those little things that you can do to kind of switch the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea of, at the very least, if it has to be digital connection, that you're trying to really help somebody to feel seen or feel like, hey, I'm with you, I love you. Jumping on FaceTime is I think the better of the communications. Because again, once at least we're seeing our faces, we're hearing our tone of voice. The thing that we're still missing is that appropriate physical touch, which can be really, really powerful, especially for a parent to a child, by the way. And the reason why it goes back to what I was talking about with attachment, when there's appropriate physical touch, just even a soft, touch on the face or the shoulder or a warm embrace of a hug, that releases oxytocin like really, really fast. And oxytocin is that powerful hormone that, helps bring the two sides back together. So it can help them feel safe when anxiety or despair is really, really high and they don't feel safe. If they're experiencing rejection or social rejection and their amygdala is going off and saying, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, my world is crashing. That physical presence of appropriate physical touch, eye contact is another thing that tends to release the oxytocin because the brain remembers feeling safe as a baby. You're looking into their eyes, you're smiling, that soft tone of voice. Tone of voice is another key element there. We talk a lot about that in the listening portion, but all of those cues release the oxytocin. So in terms of the hack, if it has to be digital, I think FaceTime is the best, but as much as possible to show up, I think is the most important thing. For the next generation and creating showing up as the hack and creating rhythms and conversation spaces. Like another hack we talk about is create a conversation place in your home where there's no electronics, no TVs. Like we have this couch that's kind of known as this conversation couch. Like if somebody's sitting on that couch, they don't have a phone in their hand, they don't have a tablet. It's just a place for us to have conversation. So being intentional with that. Another hack that I love to do is you can get these conversation kind of starters. And so at family dinner, just grab one, have a conversation, and just getting in the habit again that conversations are a normal part of our world and our life will increase the connection. Because at the end of the day, we can't force someone to open up. Because I get that question a lot too. Parents will say, how do I get my teenager to talk? You can't force them to talk, but what you can do is increase the opportunity for them to talk. So just increase the at-bats, and hopefully you'll hit a couple of home runs.
It's really helpful. Hey, Will, as we're heading towards the end of time, we did have some parents actually submit some questions to us, and so we can maybe call this as much of a lightning round as possible, as we can to
Sure.
appropriately answer what they're dealing with and some of the topics we broached down. But John, do you want to share the first question that we got from a parent here?
All right, so it's from a parent. My 17-year-old recently went through a breakup, and it was his first girlfriend. He took it really hard and kept trying to figure out what he did wrong for her to break up with him. He's become withdrawn and even angry when his siblings have brought it up. He says he's okay, but I feel like he's not. How would you talk to a teenager about a breakup and how it will be okay, and that life goes on, and that although it hurts now, the hurt won't last forever, and it's not their fault?
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I think, giving them time to emotionally exhale, and assuming that maybe that's already been done, continuing to create space and opportunity for that. Grief doesn't have a timeline. Like, it doesn't have because you experienced a breakup, you should be sad for approximately 10 and a half days. And then on the 11th day, magically, you're going to be fine. And I think we know that. The problem is we don't know grief's timeline for that specific individual, like for that 17-year-old. Like, we don't know where they're at. So I think continuing to open up the conversation, create space for conversation, don't force the conversation, but once again, kind of do some check-ins and how are you doing? And if they're still really struggling and you just feel like they're having a hard time opening up specifically to you, this is where adding an additional voice, like a counselor or a small group leader, can be really helpful. All parents of teenagers know that in this phase, it's very powerful. Our connection is very powerful to influencing them, but sometimes our voice is dismissed by them. And so having other voices that are helping reinforce and speak life into our kids can be really, really helpful. And then the other thing I would say is, if the conversation does come about, helping them to reframe that negative situation in terms of, hey, I know that this was really disappointing, like we talked about, but what are some things that maybe are opportunities now, or things that we didn't have before, and that now you do have, or what could the future look like? And maybe there's somebody else that God has in mind and in store for you. Let's imagine that together. I don't know. There's some different things that you can do, but helping them to reframe that negative situation to see that it's not the end, that there is more to this. And we just have to trust that process. But grief doesn't have a timeline, and it could take some time. I think the most important thing is just stay in touch, keep a pulse on that, and make sure that it doesn't spiral into a deeper sense of despair.
Yeah, that's helpful, Will. Hey, Will, we had two write in about a very similar topic, and we talked a little bit about this already with technology. One's a teacher, the other is a parent, and they're both related to technology. The teacher wrote, "Hey, I'm seeing more and more of my students being addicted to technology, and how do we talk about the anxiety or depression linked to it?" And then the parent wrote, "How do you incorporate it in different stages of life without sacrificing mental health?" For example, she has an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old who seem to be obsessed over YouTube videos and Roblox, and they're afraid that they could be part of some of the stats that they're seeing related to depression and anxiety. So what, in a moment, is helpful with technology related to this?
Wow, you're going to get me on a soapbox on this one. So
Roblox,
day,
we got the Roblox in our house too,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we have to teach teenagers and kids the importance of boundaries and moderation when it comes to technology. We already teach them this, by the way. For instance, we say things like, hey, you can have some candy, but don't eat too much, because what? It'll make your stomach hurt, right? We teach them the importance of healthy eating and sleep and so on. And we set boundaries for them in this regard. We need to set boundaries for the developing mind when it comes to social media and technology use. It's not popular. My kids tell me all the time, well, so-and-so's parents don't do this. And here's my response to them. I say, well, just remember, you have better parents. And maybe,
and
they
one
roll
real
their
quick.
eyes usually. Yeah, they roll their eyes usually at that one. But we just have to set some boundaries, and especially for kids who are under the age of 10, I think, I think the standard is they should have only like an hour of screen time. That feels really hard to hit at times. So give yourself lots of grace, but how close to that can you get? And create some moderation and some boundaries. I'm a big fan of bark.us. It's a monitoring tool, especially for preteens and teenagers, where you can kind of see some of their social media usage and their communication. And it's AI driven. So if something pops up, it'll notify you so you can review it. So I just think we can't just give kids the keys to social media at 13 and say, good luck out there. It would be like us, giving them the keys to a car at 16 without having a learner's permit for a year and helping them. So I'm not saying that we avoid it. I'm just saying we should sit in the passenger seat with them, with technology and with social media and so on, and help them to learn the boundaries. I like to tell teenagers, don't wait for somebody else to tell you to create a boundary. Just create the boundary yourself, because most teenagers I've talked to, they understand that there's negative consequences to all of this stuff, and they want to be taught how to apply some of this moderation and these boundaries. So I think we just got to make it practical and help them to set some standards for themselves, and agreed standards. So not just telling your kid, like, here's what you're going to do. Maybe have a conversation. Say, hey, what do you think would be helpful? What do you think is an appropriate time to be off all screens? And then they may say 11 o'clock and you say, let's meet in the middle, 9:30 or 10 o'clock, but I think the dialogue is important, and in helping them be a part of the conversation when it comes to creating boundaries and moderation with technology.
That's really good. John, we'll put a link of that bark in the description. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Would you include like some of the statistics and the dangers in that conversation? Is that like outlining, hey, here are some of the things that other students have experienced, and we want to help prevent that from you? Because I know one of the big elements that a lot of students told me when they would have these conversations with their parents is they felt like they weren't trusted. And how do we maintain that concept of, you want to let your kids are trusted, but the trust but confirm and all those types of phrases. How do you help them still feel trusted while still giving them the process to set those boundaries?
I think that's why the conversation is so important, where they're part of the boundary setting themselves. Like, so it's not just here's what you're going to do, and here's your boundaries, and here's your restrictions. It's hey, what can we determine together? Because here's why. The goal isn't just to restrict them. The goal is to teach them health and mental health specifically. And I think if we keep it centered around that the end goal is that we're trying to be healthy together. And I'm applying the same principles I'm applying for you, I'm applying to me. Like, I'm going to watch my own screen time, because, okay, let me pause on this one too. We can't just keep shouting to the next generation about their digital addiction without looking at our own digital addictions. Digital addiction is not just a next generation problem. It's an everyone problem. It's now starting to be seen in even older demographics. And so all that to say, so I think the way that we navigate I want to be trusted by you, it's not I don't trust you. It's how can we create boundaries, just like, we would never say eat endless amounts of sugar and candy. Like, hey, how do we create some standards together so that we can win here, and specifically guard and care for your mental health as a whole? And I do think most teenagers do respond to that well, because they get it, they see it. I think the stats can be helpful for certain personalities, but I think most importantly is just having a conversation.
That's helpful. Hey, well, last question that we got, we won't read out loud because there was a lot of personal details there, but I wanted to summarize, because I think this is a very helpful topic. To summarize, the question is, how can you help your child's mental health when your marriage or your close relationship, maybe with your partner, is going through a really tough time? Parents right now are going through counseling. They're wondering if the marriage is going to make it. They're aware that this is probably having some impact on their child. What would you say to them when that's happening?
My first thought goes to don't navigate it alone. Like, this is probably a really good season to ask for help. And whether that help is through a counselor or through a small group leader that kind of leans in, or a pastor or a coach, but don't just navigate it alone and just try to assume that it's not affecting your kid, because you're right in the sense that, it's probably affecting them. Oh yeah, it's definitely affecting them. And so they need a place where they can process, and they may not be able to emotionally exhale with mom or dad in that situation because they don't want to get stuck or feel caught in the middle. And they don't want mom or dad to feel worse about how they're feeling, especially if it's a pretty, intuitive kid. They may be suppressing and pushing their own emotions down, not feeling like they can really open up because they don't want to put added pressure on a strained relationship. So having another place where they can open up and be honest and emotionally exhale, I think is a really key element in those kind of scenarios.
That's really helpful. And that's why having other caring adults in the life of your kids and students is just critically important for times like this. So
yeah,
that's good.
Yeah. And that's one aspect of a very complex situation, but
absolutely.
Obviously the connection side of what we've already discussed, all that matters too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, Will, do you have any final thoughts or any other ideas that you want to share with us before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think the most important thing is that as parents and caring adults, that we just remember that connection is a big part of the healing when somebody's experiencing anxiety or despair, or just going through a hard time. Keep showing up. That would be my encouragement. Keep showing up, show up, and see them, and listen deeply, and help the next generation to overcome these challenges that we're facing today.
That's really good. Thank you, Will. Hey, before I turn it over to John to shut us down, just wanted to give everyone just some practical next steps that we would encourage. One that I would encourage everyone to do is to click the link below and to get this book seen. Will, thank you for making it short and really practical. It just took me just a couple of days to read it. And so it's not overwhelming for any adult to read through and find helpful. So thank you for that. And then another next step I want to encourage families and parents to take: if your kid or student is not yet connected in our Ridge Kids or Ridge student environments, I think what Will is sharing about having another caring adult is a critical reason why you want to get them involved with that, because we provide other caring adults that'll be on your side and for your kid and for your students. So I'd encourage you to check out our Ridge Kids and Ridge student environments. And then for parents and adults, you yourself, we need community. We need to connect, as Will's talking about. Right now, as we're recording this is the end of January. Our winter Ridge groups are opening up in just a few weeks. And so we're going to link our website below. Check that out, get connected, and see and feel seen. So Will, thank you very much. Hey, John, do you have any final comments or thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, just on YouTube, you can find all this stuff in the description. So you'll find links to Will's book, to how you can get plugged in with Ridge Kids, Ridge students, or Ridge groups. And then we'll also link bark.us as a tool for technology. We'll have some other guides as well in there. But yeah, you can check that. And then on our podcast, it'll be in our show notes. So thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. And have a wonderful week.